Okay, so welcome everyone to the penultimate episode of the Humane Philosophy Project Ian Ramsey Centre seminar series on the topic of supernaturalism. I'd like to thank once again the University of Warsaw's Institute of Philosophy, Blackfriars Hall, and the Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religion here at Oxford for supporting this series. And I'm very happy to introduce to you today Professor Tim Crane. Tim is Knightbridge Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cambridge, where he has many distinguished students. He formerly spent 19 years at UCL and indeed founded the Institute of Philosophy at the University of London. He's philosophy consultant, editor for the Times Literary Supplement, and for the current academic year, he's also president of the Aristotelian Society. Tim's mainly known for his work in the philosophy of mind, where he's attempted to address some of the most general questions about the nature or essence of the human mind. But today he's going to talk to us about how we should think about the contrast between the natural and the supernatural. So please give a very warm welcome to Tim Crane.
Ralph, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation, and it's great to be here. It's one of my rules in giving a lecture is that you should never apologise. Never apologise, never explain, as sometimes people say. But explaining is fine, but never apologise. And I'm trying not to apologise, but I have a cold, so I have to apologise for that, for not being as clear as I might be from an auditory point of view. The other thing I'd like to apologise for is forcing the time to be changed, and thank you very much for staying for this. I had a meeting that went on in Oxford longer than I had anticipated. I'm going to make a few remarks about the contrast between the natural and the supernatural and how it affects the philosophy of the mind. Ralph asked me to talk in this series, and I was wondering about whether to talk about the supernatural in a broader metaphysical sense. But having thought about what I could usefully say on this subject, I decided that I would say some things about the supernatural in connection with the mind and in connection with the doctrine of naturalism. And here is a word from my sponsor. This is Rembrandt's portrait of Aristotle contemplating a bust of Homer. It's not a very good reproduction, but it's a wonderful picture. So I want to talk about the idea of naturalism and what it is for something to be natural, and how that applies to our thinking about the mind. And I will talk for about 30 minutes on this subject. I think anyone who's familiar with the philosophy of the mind of the last 50, 60 or maybe 70 years will recognise this fact that much philosophy of the mind in the Anglo-American tradition is naturalistic. Naturalism is supposed to be a constraint on the philosophy of mind. Naturalism is much older than the 20th century, I think, as a view or as a commitment. But I think within the study of the mind, the idea that naturalism is a constraint on the philosophy of mind is something that has emerged in the last few decades. My aim in these short remarks today is to just question that idea, and I'll question that by drawing this contrast between the natural and the supernatural. What I'm going to say, first of all, I'll say a little bit about naturalism and the natural, then I'll say a little bit about naturalism and the supernatural and what that might mean, and then I'm going to say something about the mind-body question and the contrast between physicalism and dualism about the mind, and whether there is an alternative, a way out of this this binary choice that we're offered. So first of all, let me say something about naturalism, about the mind. Some philosophers think of naturalism as the same view as physicalism or materialism. Materialism traditionally is the view that everything is matter. Physicalism I see as the inheritor of that view. Materialism is a kind of 17th century view that had its perhaps starting point in the 17th century, was dominant in certain parts of 19th century philosophy, but in the 20th century I think physicalism became the inheritor of the main central ideas of materialism, on the grounds that the dominance of physics as a complete science of nature should lead the way in philosophy also. So the physical here, what physical means is that physical is the subject matter of physics. So forces, fields, atoms, molecules, and subatomic particles, and all that kind of thing. Now, it seems to me that physicalism is not the same thing as naturalism, that physicalism is naturalistic, I should say, physicalism is naturalistic, but not necessarily vice versa. If you think that the natural is just what is contained within nature, then it's an open question whether everything that's contained within nature is physical in the sense of physicalism. So I think we should not identify naturalism with physicalism, at least in the most schematic and general understandings of these words. So what is naturalism then? Well, I suppose the uninformative definition is that everything is natural, which only raises the question, or begs the question, as now another word has come to mean in journalistic circles, and we have to follow the march of language. You know, meaning is use, after all. So if people carry on saying that begs the question means raises the question, then I'm sorry, philosophers, we just have to accept it. But at the moment, I want to say this raises the question, not begs the question. What is the natural? But what is it that's natural? And here, in our scientific age, we get the answer from some philosophers that the natural is the subject matter of natural science. Now note the order of explanation here. The order of explanation is to explain a metaphysical doctrine, that is to say naturalism, a view about the world as a whole, that everything is natural, in terms of a claim about science. And I think we should not necessarily jump on board that way of understanding things. I think we're not going to get a deep understanding of what these issues about naturalism and supernaturalism are by reflecting on the current alignment of disciplines within university departments of science, natural science versus social science and so on. What is a natural science after all? In universities, natural science might be contrasted with social science. In my university, the University of Cambridge, they have something called the natural science tripos. Now, don't ask me what a tripos is. I've taught at Cambridge for many years. I'm not entirely sure what a tripos is, what the essence of a tripos is, but perhaps we can address that question in discussion. But anyway, natural science the natural science tripos was contrasted in the 19th century with the moral sciences tripos, and then the moral sciences now has disappeared. But social science is also, there was an attempt to have a social science tripos in Cambridge too, which means a degree programme. But if we're thinking in terms of an ordinary idea of what natural is, it's a very strange thing to say that social phenomena like societies and law courts and social structures, governments and things like this are not natural. Unless, of course, the contrast we're interested in is that between the natural and the artificial. As Hume discussed the difference between natural, the natural sentiments and artificial sentiments. So, if that's what the contrast is, then I can understand that, because in some sense, societies are constructions of human activity. Governments are constructions of human activity. Social facts are in some way artificial in the sense that they're artifacts. They're creations of our minds. But that's not what people mean when they contrast the natural with the non-natural. They don't mean by this actually the artificial. So I'm going to put the natural-artificial distinction, which I think is a good distinction. I'm going to put that to one side. That's not the important thing. If you think of Aristotle's idea of a substance is something that's capable of generating itself. An artifact is not a substance. If you have a bed made of unseasoned wood and you leave it out in the garden, it'll grow a tree, it won't grow another bed. So this is the sort of Aristotelian distinction between the artifact and the natural substance. So I think artifact, natural and artificial is a good distinction, but that's not what people have in mind when they're contrasting the natural as a subject matter of naturalism with the non-natural. Rather, what they have in mind is something closer to the idea of the natural and the supernatural. That's supposed to be the contrast. So I say that should the contrast be, I think that is the contrast that's understood by people who think that denying naturalism about the mental, and that's going to be my subject matter, denying naturalism about the mental somehow leads you to the idea that the mental is something supernatural. The mind is supernatural. Unless you uphold naturalism about the mind, then you have to think that the mind is supernatural. So maybe this is what naturalism is, that nothing is supernatural. Now, just in case you think I'm making this up, I could cite many philosophers. I mean, of course, I'm making it all up, but that's philosophy. You make it up as you go along. But I could cite many introductory texts in the philosophy of mind who start off with something like this idea. They say, intuitively, we all think that our minds are something distinct from our bodies, and that this is the view of common sense. It goes back to the Christian view that your soul can survive your body's death, and it's got something to do with that, and that's what Descartes thought. And it meant that the mind was a kind of spooky thing, reference to Gilbert Ryle, philosopher of this university, the ghost in the machine. So if you don't believe in naturalism about the mind, then you believe in ghosts in the machine, spooky stuff, surviving your death, and things like that. That's the first chapter of introductory books on philosophy of mind, apart from my own, which begins in a much more illuminating way, I believe, available from all good bookshops. I just found one quote which I like. That a man called Geoffrey Poland, he wrote a book in 1994 called Physicalism, and he said at one point, the essence of physicalism is that there are no ghosts. Now, in some sense, I think that's a joke, but I think it actually reveals something about the way physicalists think about this issue. That if you don't accept physicalism, then you accept a lot of spooky stuff. Right? Taken literally, which of course we pedantic philosophers want to take this literally, we want to say, what possibly could be the significance of saying that there are or are not ghosts? Of course there aren't ghosts. Right? How could anyone think that that is a serious question? Right? Of course there aren't any ghosts. So if dualism, or the denial of physicalism, is the view that there are ghosts, then obviously no one should be a dualist and we can all go home. And we don't need all those arguments that the philosophers put forward against the dualist view based on complicated principles about causal interaction and things like this. We don't need that. If dualism is the view that there are ghosts, then obviously we shouldn't be dualists. Right? So if Ryle is right, that what he called the received doctrine, I think he's called it this in his book, The Concept of Mind, he said the received doctrine is that the mind is a ghost in the machine. If we take Ryle at his word and take him literally, obviously that's an absurd idea and no one should ever have accepted that doctrine. So what I'm trying to persuade you is there must be something more to dualism about the mind than just the view that there's a ghost in the machine, right? Because where ghost is taken literally to mean ghost. Right? I mean, I think probably he didn't mean ghost, by ghost, but since he was uncharitable in interpreting others, we can, on a Thursday evening at 6:30, be uncharitable in interpreting him when he said the ghost in the machine. So, what's the supernatural then? What's supposed to be being contrasted here? Now, the Humane Philosophers Group have been pursuing this question for this year, so that you'll be able to tell me what your conclusions have been, but some ideas are this. One is that the supernatural is the transcendent. That is to say, what transcends the world of experience. And when I say the world of experience, I don't just mean what transcends experience, but I mean what transcends the world that we experience. So I don't think, for example, that the existence of unobservable physical particles is evidence for something transcendent. Transcendent is beyond whatever's found out by science and experience. And I think this is a very, very important idea. If I were talking about the essence of religious belief, which is another thing I was thinking of talking about, but in the end I didn't, then I would say that idea of the transcendent is absolutely central to religious belief, by which I don't mean any specific theistic doctrine. I just mean the idea that something transcends the world that we experience. And so I think that's a very important part of, and that is, I think, part of the idea of the supernatural. More specifically, perhaps, and therefore harder to understand, is the idea that there might be something outside the world of space-time, or the world that's in space-time, something not governed by the laws of nature. Now, if naturalism rejects the supernatural in that sense, then naturalism says that nothing is transcendent or anomalous, not governed by the laws of nature. So, as a philosopher of mind, I want then to ask, well, which views of the mind does this rule out, actually? Which views of the mind does naturalism rule out? Well, maybe it rules out the view that the mind is the immortal soul that survives the death of the body, or maybe it rules out the view that the mind is unconstrained by the laws of nature, so that our minds can actually break the laws of nature, assuming that those laws of nature govern the physical world, and the mind could break those laws. Perhaps this is why people think that psychical research, research that investigates telepathy and other psychical phenomenon, parapsychological phenomenon. So it used to be called psychical research, it's now called parapsychology. Perhaps that's why people think parapsychology would investigate supernatural things, because it investigates things that break the laws of nature, perhaps. Someone once said a funny thing about psychical research, that it's the only branch of science that where you find something that's inconsistent with the laws of nature, then that's counted as a success. So, anyway, I don't think that these views of the mind treat it as previously I said, which views of the mind does this rule out? I said these views. But which views of the mind does it not rule out? That's the thing. So which views of the mind are consistent with naturalism, considered as the denial of the supernatural? And there it seems to me that the field is entirely wide open, and therefore naturalism doesn't offer much of a constraint on theories of the mind. The contemporary, what's called a property dualist view, where you think that mental properties are distinct properties from the physical properties of organisms, or on slightly more left field end of things, a hermeneutic or interpretative view of the mind, where you think of the mental states are the products somehow of our interpretation of one another. None of these views treat the mind as supernatural in the relevant sense. So when you go to your introduction to philosophy of mind, and it introduces you to Descartes and his dualism, it's no part of Descartes' dualism that the mind is a supernatural thing in that, in the sense that I've just described. So Descartes, this was the essence of Descartes' dualism. He said, each of us, is a thinking thing. I'm connected to my body. My body and I do form some kind of unity. And in fact, my body and I causally interact. And this is all understood in terms of a background ontology of substance and attribute. I was struck coming into this room by a vivid memory. It was a surprise to me. I'd been in this room before, I think 37 years ago, when I was at school here in Oxford. I attended some lectures by Brian Davis, who was in the community here in Blackfriars. And they were public lectures on God and philosophy. But in fact, they were a wonderful series of lectures because they were an introduction to some central concepts of philosophy. And this is where I first heard about Descartes' dualism and his views about substance and attribute. Brian Davies, who's now in New York, in Fordham University in New York. So this, just a personal touch, 10 minutes before the end of my talk. Descartes' views are well known. The essence of the view involves this idea of substance, and that the mind, or the soul, is a substance. And a substance here means something that's capable of independent existence, capable of existing independently of anything else. Each substance, he thought, had its own characteristic attribute, and the characteristic attribute of mental substance was thought. And that's Descartes' dualism. There's nothing there about the supernatural. So if naturalism is the view that there is nothing supernatural, then why should naturalism be opposed to Descartes' dualism? That's my first point. So, broadening the lens slightly to look at the mind-body debate as a whole is standardly understood these days in terms of a choice between dualism, where you think of mind and body as two, and physicalism or materialism, which treat everything as material. And my first point I want to make, as I say, is that naturalism, as I've just defined it, has very little to do with that debate. So, someone who rejects physicalism, someone who rejects, the debate, the mind-body debate is about, if it's about the dispute between physicalism and dualism, then it follows from what I just said that someone who rejects physicalism does not have to say that the mind is supernatural. To dramatize this, I reject physicalism and all its works and empty promises. I reject physicalism, but I don't say thereby that the mind is something supernatural in the sense that I just characterized, which I think has some content that transcendent or contravening the laws of nature, or both. So this is why I say naturalism is irrelevant to the mind-body question, construed in that way. There may be some more vague doctrine of naturalism which is relevant to the mind-body question, but that's only because the vaguer you get, then something's relevant, then the vague doctrine can be relevant to anything. So, if you want to stay relevant, make yourself vague. You want to be irrelevant, just be precise. That's a lesson for philosophy. Right? Maybe that's not always a good thing. Okay, let me say something then about physicalism, finally, and how we should think about an alternative to a physicalist view. Physicalism is the view that everything is physical in some sense, I like to say, because actually a lot of physicalists who talk about everything, it turns out that they don't mean everything is physical, because some physicalists say, yes, everything is physical, well, apart from all those things that are non-physical but are determined by the physical. So there it looks like the phrase in some sense functions as what logicians would call a negation operator. That is to say, it's not the case that everything is physical, right? If everything is physical in some sense, when you say with someone, if you want to be polite and disagree with you, you might say, well, I agree with you in some sense, which means you don't agree with them. So, rather like the famous example of in Australia, in Australia mammals lay eggs. Clearly this is another case where you use the words in Australia to mean negation, because obviously mammals don't lay eggs, except in Australia. So in which sense is that's the important question. What here, and I think the way to understand that question is to ask yourself, what is really the opposition between physicalism and dualism? If you're introduced to this question of what the nature of the mind is by first of all being told Descartes thought there were two substances, then you might think that the way to deny that is to say that there aren't two substances, there's only one. So you might think physicalism is a view about substance. That is to say, physicalism is a form of substance monism, where you think so you think that the fundamental question in metaphysics is the question about substance, about what the nature of substance is. Physicalism is a monistic view, and then Cartesianism is a dualistic view. There are two substances rather than one. But in fact, that's not how physicalism is conceived these days. The notion of substance does not enter into the way people talk about justify physicalism. So something's gone wrong with this contrast between physicalism and dualism if the terms in which the dualistic view is expressed are not the terms in which, anything to do with the terms in which the physicalist view is expressed. So let me just explain that briefly. The notion of substance has largely disappeared from mainstream metaphysics. I don't regard that as a good thing, but I think it's true. I think mainstream analytic metaphysics does not have any place for the notion of substance. If we take, for example, the influential work of David Lewis, who's probably one of the most influential analytic metaphysicians, his world picture is based on physics, and he says, he starts off, he describes the world, he says there's space-time, and there are physical properties instantiated at space-time points, and everything else supervenes on that. That's his view of the world. Supervenes means that if you take the whole world, that is to say the whole universe, and you suppose there to be a total physical duplicate of that whole world, then that will be a duplicate in every respect. So you, just like if you duplicated this glass in all its physical respects, you duplicate it in all other respects. And that is now the formulation of physicalism. It's the view that everything is fixed by the fundamental physical properties of things. You could bring it out with a theological metaphor. You could say that supposing God was creating the world, what would God have to do to create this world just exactly as it is now, this minute? According to physicalists, all God would have to do would be just to create the fundamental particles, and everything else would just come automatically. So on the physicalist view, God doesn't need 6 days to make the world. God could make the world in 1 day and then have 6 days off. Maybe days would be something different then. So yeah. So all God would have to do would be just to create the physical nature of the world, and everything else would come for free. That's what physicalism says. It doesn't say anything about substance at all. There's no mention of substance. It doesn't say there's one substance which has these properties. There isn't. Substance has disappeared from the whole physicalist vocabulary because they take their conception of the world from physics, and physics thinks in terms of space-time, in terms of fundamental particles, and these categories. So, let me say something very briefly for those who are familiar with the contemporary dualists. For example, David Chalmers's book, The Conscious Mind, which was a dualist view. You can see now why this is a dualist view in a way that has nothing to do with the old question of substance. Chalmers's view is this, that if what he calls a zombie is possible, whereas a zombie is a physical replica of you or me, which lacks consciousness, he says then physicalism is false. So, and that means dualism is true. If a zombie is possible, then physicalism is false. And it's easy to see why that's supposed to be opposed to physicalism, because that's a counterexample to this supervenience thesis I just mentioned. But once again, this says nothing about substance. And it doesn't treat the non-physical mind as something supernatural. In fact, Chalmers calls his view naturalistic dualism. So the point I'm trying to get across is that there's this assumption that thinking of the world as entirely natural rules out certain views of the mind and privileges certain other views of the mind. And I want to say that it doesn't do that if natural means not supernatural. What's more, the traditional debate between physicalism and dualism is not a debate between people who think the mind is supernatural and people who think it's natural. It's not even about the denial of Cartesian dualism, because that was a view about substance, and this isn't. Any physicalism these days has nothing to do with substance. Now, when I say this to people who I'm trying to persuade of my destructive view of this mind-body problem, they say to me, but physicalism is a very common sense idea. It's a very common sense, sort of natural idea. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? Certainly not that view that I just mentioned, that every physical duplicate of the actual world is a duplicate in every respect. That's not a common sense idea. That's a really, really specialized philosophical idea that you need a whole bunch of concepts and years of philosophical training even to get your head around what that means. But then my opponents, they always say, yeah, but it's just basically, it's the idea that everything's made out of the same sort of stuff. Scott. Now, I agree that's a natural idea. Everything's made out of the same sort of stuff. That's something that's characteristic of what our modern conception of the world, that, you know, for example, living things and inanimate things are made out of the same kind of matter. But what does that say about our idea of the mind? How does our idea of the mind fit into that idea that everything's made out of the same sort of stuff? When we talk about the mind, philosophically speaking, we talk about things like mental properties or mental states. A property like having a belief, or a state of believing something, or a mental event or a mental process, thinking through something, or a mental event like a sensation or a perception or something. So we're talking about properties, states, processes and things. How does that fit with the idea that everything's made out of the same kind of stuff? What are properties and states made of? And when I'm having this debate with people, then this is when normally they they say, oh, is that the time? I really must be going. So, and I think what I would like to persuade people of is that there's another way of thinking about this whole question about the mind and how it's related to the material world and the natural world, if you like. And I think that if we take our lead from Aristotle rather than from Descartes, then I think we will get a better conception of what's going on, which maybe is a good thing to say in a Dominican house, roughly on the side of the whole Dominican vibe. But I'm not going to say very much about this because I think it'd be better to leave the remaining time for discussion. So let me just say two things, and it's really the contrast. What I want to, the first thing is that I want to contrast the Aristotelian conception of a substance with the Cartesian conception. As I said, the Cartesian conception is that that a substance is something that's capable of independent existence. So it's a very abstract idea. So if the mind and matter are capable of independent existence, then they're separate substances. The Aristotelian idea was a much more, I think, although I've made fun of this word, but I want to say it now. I was going to say it's a much more naturalistic idea. In the sense, it's much more natural to think that what you're looking for is what are the basic elements of the world? What are the natural unities in the world? For Aristotle, the paradigm of a substance was an organism. The organism was the paradigm substance, not some very abstract idea like Descartes' idea of matter considered just as extension or size and shape. Rather, the Aristotelian idea was something that was held together in its own unity by its own principles of activity. And I think that if we want a more natural way of understanding, a more natural way of approaching the metaphysics of the world as we experience it, we'd be better off starting with an Aristotelian conception of substance rather than the Cartesian conception. Once we have the Aristotelian conception of substance, then the question of physicalism and dualism doesn't really arise. There's a question about what is the mind, and this is my second point, and I think this is going to be my final point. If you have this, start with this Aristotelian conception of substance, what is the mind on this conception? Well, the mind isn't a substance. The mind is not a substance in either sense. What I mean is the Cartesian conception of substance is incorrect. But the mind is not a substance in the Aristotelian sense. It's the organism that's the substance. what we call the mind, I think, is a good name for the collection of capacities, the mental capacities or faculties of the organism. The capacities of perception, or memory, the capacity for language, reasoning, decision-making, imagination. That, I think, is the way to think about what this thing we call the mind, rather than thinking of the mind as the substance. On the Aristotelian view, the organism is the substance. The organism has various capacities. Some of these capacities are mental capacities. Now, against my will, I realise that this is actually a rather naturalistic view, in the sense that these names of these capacities would be then I can't resist saying that those would be the chapter headings in a psychology textbook. So if you think psychology is a natural science, then psychology studies these capacities. So we do get to some sort of naturalism after all. There's a few more things I could say about this, but I think let me just rush to my conclusion instead, and then we can have some questions. So, first point I want to make is that naturalism is not a significant constraint on theories of the mind. And the natural-supernatural contrast is largely irrelevant to the philosophy of mind, which is not to say that it's a meaningless contrast. I think it's an important contrast, but it's not relevant to the understanding of the mind, unless you think literally that the mind is the ghost in the machine. So even the question of Cartesian dualism, I think, does not rely on this contrast. And then I want to say, and this will be my Aristotelian conclusion that I would draw, that it's best not to think of the mind as a substance anyway. And this provides us, I would argue, although I haven't said it here, with a different way to think about the mind-body contrast. So, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tim. We have about 15 minutes for questions, and just to remind you, please do allow the microphone to be taken over to you by MindBody before you deliver your question, so it is picked up on our recording. Gentleman back here.
Thank you very much.
It's on already.
It's on. Thank you very much for your lecture. My question is on mental causation. First, in relation to Descartes, and then maybe a little more generally. You said at some point that one of the things that naturalism excludes is that mental causation breaks the laws of nature. You also said that Descartes' conception of the mind, of course, amounts to no supernaturalism.
Yes. So Descartes' conception of the mind
entails no supernaturalism.
That's right, yeah.
Now, of course, Descartes wants it that way, but I think it's difficult for him when he deals with the interaction between mind and body. Of course, he wants the mind not to interfere with the laws of nature, the laws of the body. And that's why he says the mind only needs to change the speed of the animal spirits, not the direction. Yeah. That's a way of saying the mind doesn't have to interfere with the laws of nature. That doesn't work. The only solution, as Leibniz said, is because, of course, there's a force there, is parallelism. Mm-hmm. But apart from that historical question there, the point would be, of course, Descartes doesn't appeal to supernaturalism, but it's difficult to say that he doesn't need mental causation, even if he doesn't need supernaturalism. So
yeah, I see.
Both things.
Absolutely, yeah.
So both things you said, naturalism doesn't have to say that mental causation breaks the laws of nature, and then more generally. But if mental causation doesn't break the laws of nature, without supernaturalism, it really seems to do it.
Yes.
Or it comes very close to it. Don't we need to say sort of way that mental causation without supernaturalism does, in a sense, break the laws of nature. If we take by nature physicalism or body or physiology, there's some sort of way in which mental causation is so unique and so...
Thank you very much. No, that's a very important question, and I rushed over it. The point I would stand by is that, of course, Descartes himself did not have his conception of the mind and mental causation was compatible with the laws of physics as he understood them. As you say, as Leibniz pointed out, he was wrong about the laws of physics. So his conception, it wasn't that he wasn't aiming for a supernatural conception of the mind on which mental causation broke the laws of physics. As a matter of fact, since he was wrong about the empirical facts, he would have to say, if he maintained Leibniz's conception of the laws of physics, that mental causation will break the laws of physics. Now, he didn't live long enough to be able to answer that criticism, but I guess my estimate would be that he wouldn't say, okay, the mind breaks the laws of physics then. I think he wouldn't have said that. He would have come up with some other ingenious idea. Nonetheless, I mean, his theory is so riddled with empirical falsehoods. I mean, there are no animal spirits. The mind does not affect the direction of motion or the speed of motion of the animal spirits at the pineal gland. So there are so many things wrong with that view. So we could abstract away from that and ask ourselves, does a dualist view of mental causation in itself involve violation of the laws of physics? And I think then the answer is no. I mean, even a substance dualist view of some kind. I think the answer is no, but that will be a longer story that I've written about elsewhere. But thanks for your question. That's an important point.
Andrew.
Thank you. I've always thought that at a certain level, up the academic ladder, everything's become as clear again, and you've just given a demonstration of that, so I'm very, very grateful for the decades of clarity you've given to us today. But the question I want to ask about is about understanding, because this is the... philosophers don't seem to talk that much about it. So last time we looked on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, there's lots of articles on knowledge, lots of articles on truth. All these are mental faculties. For understanding, there's no entries. And I get very curious when people ignore a whole topic that's so important in daily life. How do you understand understanding? And the reason why it relates to the issue of this talk particularly is that there is a sense in our history of our ideas that there's something more divine about this faculty than shall we say, sequential reasoning or logic. Because the moment of divine illumination, that sort of thing.
Right.
So do you have any insights into insight?
But well, I doubt whether understanding is one thing. So I do think understanding isn't the same thing as knowledge, or at least not knowledge in the narrow sense that they study it in epistemology. I mean, I think philosophy, for example, is a form of understanding, and it's not always a form of knowledge. I think so. I think but I doubt whether there's a faculty of understanding, a mental faculty, as opposed to our faculty of reasoning. Not because I think every case of understanding is sequential reasoning or can be modelled by inference, but because I think there are just too many things put under the heading of understanding. I mean, I'm not sure I've got anything to say on the divinity or not of that faculty, but understanding another person, understanding a text, understanding a piece of music, understanding a wine, for example, or, these. So I'm sympathetic to the idea that understanding is not knowledge, or not just knowledge, but involves knowledge, but I think that's all I can say at the moment, so it's not very, very superficial, I'm afraid. Yeah.
I think we should... gosh. And then we can move left.
Thank you very much for your talk. A little bit perhaps off topic, but you discussed very briefly hermeneutic or interpretive theories of the mind. And I just wanted to ask, perhaps a quite a general question, how fruitful you thought those were. I've just been reading your draft paper of the Aristotelian Society lecture you gave, and you cited Paul Katsafanis' book on Nietzsche.
Mm-hmm.
Would you include that as an interpretive theory of the mind in terms of Nietzsche's moral psychology, for example, or perhaps sort of Freudian or psychoanalytic theories of the mind?
Exactly,
Or even sort of someone like Charles Taylor, or even Richard Moran, who's quite critical of Charles Taylor. I just wanted to ask generally.
Yeah. I don't know enough about Charles Taylor to say, but all the other examples are, I think, cases of what I mean by hermeneutic. Somehow that the mental reality itself is a product of its own self-understanding, or actually, I'm coming back to understanding again. So self-understanding or the understanding of another. So I think that, and one of the things I claim in that paper is that it's wrong to impose the structure of a conscious piece of reasoning or a conscious thought, just think that structure somehow is not essentially conscious but could be exactly the same as in the unconscious, and that, but rather what interpretation does is recover the mental reality from what's below the surface of consciousness, and so in some sense creates the reality. This is why, in fact, I think I got this idea, I think, from Moran, that the distinction between making up your mind and finding out what you think is not a sharp distinction. I think once you accept that, then you can see that some facts about your unconscious are created by your own interpretation. And in psychoanalysis, whatever truth there is in psychoanalysis, it's something like that, except there it's in the psychoanalytic session. I'm not committing myself to the whole Freudian account, but something like that, I think, is true. So those are examples. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think Brother Jordan had a question, and then I know the gentleman on the end there and the gentleman here.
Yes. Gentleman here too. Yeah.
Brother Jordan did, but he forgot what it was.
Care to make one?
Well, I'm sure I can comment on the excellence of using Aristotle. That was definitely the right thing to do.
I know I was in good company here.
It was interesting. In your talk, you chose physicalism rather than materialism in your contrast of the natural and the supernatural. I thought it was a very, at least in the day-to-day questions one receives, as someone who very obviously and publicly believes in the supernatural, on the question of the mind and mental causality as something which must be supernatural, by which they mean it seems to be something immaterial. And obviously in an Aristotelian context or a Thomistic and therefore correct context, we want to include the immaterial in the natural picture.
Yes.
And for us, I think supernatural really means an order of causality which is something of quite different from one's in the natural world. We do have immaterial causality in the natural world. We would want to say on an Aristotelian, Thomistic, Cartesian basis. Why did you choose physicalism rather than materialism?
It's not immensely important to me to use that word rather than the other word, except that materialism, I think, has the connotation that that matter is all there is.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you listen to physics tells you that the matter is one thing, then there's space-time, and then there are fields, and then there are forces. And are these things matter, or not in any obvious sense? So I take this just as a historical development of the basic materialist inclination that once physics developed in such a way that you couldn't keep on saying that everything was made up of just little bits of matter, where we had some independent idea of what matter is. Instead, you just, so to speak, defer to what physics says, what the physics of matter says, or what physics of space-time or so on says. So that's the only significance of that. But I regard them as, roughly speaking, with a few, obviously annoying kind of ways in which you can distinguish things, like the way that philosophers do, which I won't talk about now, but they're basically the same idea, basically. I don't think that the Aristotelian view that I defend, and I don't know what the Thomistic view is really. I have a very superficial understanding of the Thomistic view. The way I understand it, this isn't immaterial causation, except in the sense that that causation takes place because of the form rather than the matter. And if you mean that, then I agree with you. There is such a thing as immaterial causation. But if there is immaterial causation in that sense, then it doesn't break the laws of physics, because you'd have to understand the laws of physics as compatible with these things that are real, like, you know, that our wills act on the world and our desires act on the world. So I wouldn't put it as immaterial in any supernatural sense, but immaterial yes, perhaps in terms of the Aristotelian contrast between matter and form.
I mean, it just seems to me that the supernatural point has no relevance. Well, not that no relevance, but to your question, supernatural, natural.
Yeah.
It's not about dealing with what is supernatural.
That's right.
It's about reclaiming what is natural.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Exactly. Yeah. So in fact, my talk had nothing to do with the theme of the Humane Philosophers series.
Thank you for pointing that out.
That's why we're here.
Yeah.
So we have time for 3 more short questions. The gentleman towards the back there, if he still has. Sorry, did you have one? 4 more short.
The gentleman in the front row too
And
has
then
one.
there's the 2 gentlemen in front row.
But this gentleman here has to go and collect his dog. So maybe he could ask the first question.
Well, we can have your question first.
I'm most grateful. Thank you for your forbearance. And I would like to applaud that last remark, to reclaim the natural from the supernatural.
Yeah.
But mine isn't a question. It's just that you've given me a perfectly crazy idea, and I'd like to put it to you. One of your descriptions of the mind is as an organ of perception. Mm-hmm. And all my life, and I imagine, excuse me, all your life, you've supposed that the mind makes perceptions of nature. Here's a mad idea. What if the universe makes the perceptions in the mind? Then all your categories disappear. You'd have to start again. Because if the universe is actually imposing perceptions on our mind, then it's quite clear why we all have generally the same perceptions. Otherwise, we'd fall over each other. But it would also mean that occasionally, by some fluke, some accident, some choice, the universe could provide a quite definitely different perception, and that would be called a discovery. Not an argument. A discovery, a new item of knowledge, not of argument, of knowledge. Oh, we say, I never saw that before. That's the idea you've given me. I'm most grateful.
Well, thank you very much. I think the idea is there's too many things in that idea for me to be able to address in a few seconds. But let me say one thing. I agree with you. The universe gives us perceptions in the sense that our perception is, in some sense, passive with respect. You know, the universe is out there and it's giving us these perceptions. But I also think that our perceptual capacity brings something to that experience too. So I don't agree that we're just entirely passive with relation to experience. That's possible too. In fact, that's real. That is real. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Gentleman towards the back here.
We'll ask a quick question. So here's a quick question. Thank you very much. Where does this leave natural science of mind?
So I think there's just one subject matter here, which is the mental capacities. So I think in that sense there's the organisms with their mental capacities. And these mental capacities can be studied in different ways. And there is such a thing, I think, as the natural science of the mind, and it's called psychology, and now it incorporates, related to neuroscience, and there's cognitive neuroscience. And that's not the whole story of our minds and our subjectivity. It's not the whole story, but that's not because there's something else which is supernatural about the mind. It's just because the limitations of the method of studying the mind are, in the way of neuroscience and psychology are enormous limitations. But it doesn't mean that they're bad. It's just like all sciences, they're very limited.
We need a wider sense of science.
If we had a wider sense of science, would incorporate our own self-understanding, for example, and so science in the German sense, that would incorporate these things.
We're going to permit one last question. Did you? Yeah.
I was just thinking that some physicalists have started calling themselves panpsychists, and I was wondering where you would fit their understanding into your view.
Yeah. Is this being filmed? Yes. Okay.
We can edit out anything you want to say.
No, I think I'd rather be aware that it was being filmed before. I mean, this is literally true, that some of my best friends are panpsychists. This is literally true. But I think this is a terrible mistake. I think well, not terrible mistake, it's just a mistake. It's only philosophy. I mean, how terrible could it be? It's, but I think the thing that I don't accept, their starting point that I don't accept, is that they think that there must be some account, in order to solve the problem of consciousness, as they think of it, that there must be some account of the intrinsic or fundamental nature of matter. Right? And they think that physics can't provide such an account, and that's how they get to the idea that in the fundamental nature of matter there must be something that's conscious in some way. And I think when they say physics can't provide such an account, they're looking at the mathematical theories of physics as if those mathematical theories, so to speak, had a shadow on reality themselves. And then they say, reality is purely mathematical. I mean, dualists argue this too. I mean, our mutual friend Howard Robinson, he argues that, that the physical world is purely mathematical. Well, that's not true. The theories are mathematical. The physical world is whatever it is. These are just ways of dealing with theory. So I don't even get on the first stage of the argument towards panpsychism, even though I sort of think it's good that it exists. I mean, it's good that it's there, but anyway. Are you a panpsychist?
Oh, I'm not saying it.
Okay, no, okay. I don't want to be offensive. But,
Okay, I think this is all the questions that we have time for. You're more than welcome to mingle for a very short time before we have to vacate the room. But before we do, I'd just like to say that on the 16th of May, we're going to have the final installment that Ralph has alluded to before, where the speaker is going to be Andrew Pinson, the research director at the Ian Ramsey Centre. And so I encourage you all to come to this thrilling lecture that we're going to hear then. And today, I'd just like you to join me in thanking our speaker for today, Tim Craig, once again.